But Angela Morisi's charism went beyond this. She was a woman who had caught a vision because she listened with the eyes and saw with the eyes of her heart rather than just her physical senses. I was intrigued to see her visions and to read about them. And I remembered having a similar kind of vision, although not ecstatic, when I was driving down Route 128 in Boston, when I wanted to think about how to educate women. I knew that I couldn't go into the churches because no one knew me. Making a long story short, I had a vision and actually a name for a conference called Women in the Word. And I went and I advertised that and invited women from around New England to come and participate. It was a place where they learned to use their gifts, to identify their gifts, to teach others, and to speak and pray. That ministry, which started with 150 women in 1989, now brings 1,500 women from around New England. I'm no longer the leader of that because it wasn't about me as a person. It was about a vision that God had given, and that vision was passed on to others, just like the charism of Angela is passed on to you. When Paul looked at Simon when he first met him, he said, "No longer do I call you Simon, but Peter, the rock." You see, Jesus had the capacity to see beyond the surface and see with the heart. Angela was blinded when she was going to the Holy Land, and her sight was restored. It seems like a spiritual metaphor, that the things of God that we see in the Holy Land can't be apprehended with the eyes, but only with the Spirit. Hence, contemplative spirituality, which draws us and calls us, like Mary, to sit at the feet of Jesus, that we might hear the voice of the Holy Spirit calling to us and giving shape to what God would have us do today. The third part of that charism of Angela that I saw was the capacity and the courage to change. This was a woman who was way beyond her time. She was counterintuitive to her culture, and she was willing to take a risk, not because she was in any way arrogant, because her confidence was based on the call that she had received from God. And so this woman was able to engage her culture in such a way that even though people said no, and perhaps even gave resistance to what she was doing, because God was in it, it became a successful enterprise as she educated women going into their homes, actually going to where they were. This was a woman who clearly had a deep, abiding relationship with God. This courage to change is so important in our ministry, whether we're Protestant or Catholic, because I don't know if this is true with you, but in the Protestant faith, we oftentimes mistake tradition for traditionalism. There's nothing wrong with tradition. We all have valued and honored traditions. But when our traditions become calcified to the point that we are making idols of those traditions, to the place that it is barring us from seeing the call of God, to contextualize the gospel in ways that meet the needs of the world and the society that surrounds us. To that degree, we have forgotten what God has called us to do. So often in the churches that I serve, we want to hold on to the way we have done it. In the Congregational Church in Boston, when I would ask some of the elders why they did it that way, they would say, because we've always done it that way. And it seems sacrosanct to do anything other than that. God breaks all of our molds. God calls us to see beyond what is to what can be. The trick, I think, becomes learning to contextualize the gospel and the call and the charism of Angela without compromising the truth of the gospel. That becomes the cutting edge of change. But we don't know how to do that unless we're willing to take a risk, to step out and do something new. My love for women in the early days, before I was actually working in a capacity where I could see them on a regular basis and have a real reason to be writing letters to churches, I used to go down the street and knock on doors and invite women to a Bible study and then provided childcare in my basement. It wasn't the usual thing to do. It was a different thing to do. And then when I started working with a group called Vision New England, where I was a director of women's ministries in New England, working cross-denominational, the idea that came to my mind was, in this workshop called Women in the Word, was to teach women leaders, to grow them in the faith, and then to have them start ministries within the church that would then teach women about God and draw them closer to Him. That kind of visioning was a little bit daunting because many of the pastors of the church were threatened by it. They had always taught the women's Bible studies. They had always organized any of the ministries. And yet, when this ministry began to take off, I saw one group that we started with 25 the first week, and in 1 year it had grown to 150 people. We had small group teaching and training, and people learning the scriptures simply in the church. And women from the community would come that had never dawned the door of a church because they were hungry for fellowship with other people, and they were hungry for meaning and purpose. What the world needs is meaning and purpose, and the only place that we can find it, because we've been created in the image of God. And as St. Augustine says, that our hearts are restless until we find our rest in God. That whether people know it or not, they need to know about Christ, and we need to invite them in unthreatening ways that contextualizes the gospel and helps them to learn about who God is and the love of God, so that they can become transformed by the power of the gospel and then go out and give this message to others. The final charism that I picked up in Angela's life and charism was this deep sense of confidence that was then juxtaposed to a deep sense of being a sinner. That really struck me because I know that I don't deserve to be doing what I'm doing. And very often, I don't want to be doing what I'm doing. It can become autopilot sometime for me because I get tired and glazed over, and sometimes I don't know what to do at all, and I can feel like a failure. But it becomes important for me to realize at those times that those human feelings are the very thing that drives me to the cross, drives me to the feet of Christ, drives me to the things that God has called me to do.